to know, because one thing happened, the other thing didn't happen. So to try and push one above the other is, always going to be sort of from a hindsight position. But I felt like there would have been more intrigue, and there would have been more sort of curiosity as to what, this new kid might have brought to the band and sort of what Eddie saw. And I think with Gary Cherone, it was sort of going to be solid, but it was going to be nothing more than that. I mean, I don't think anybody, even before they heard those songs, was widely excited about the prospect of thinking, oh my God, this is the guy to, push Van Halen to the next level. It was like the holding pattern, not much more than that. And it's unfair to Gary Cherone. And obviously Eddie himself was supremely proud of that record. And in his eyes, it was, one of the best sets of songs that he had ever written. So, a painful kind of lesson. And I think the blame can't be sort of laid on Gary Cherone's shoulders for that. He was in a difficult position, almost an impossible situation as it turned out. I think it would have been more exciting for all concerned if Rich Malloy had had that shot.
Yeah, that's the truth. Also, with the failure of Van Halen 3, do you think that really crushed Eddie? It seemed like it went beyond, I guess, just a flat album. It seemed like it almost personally hurt him, because he went into a hole after that for a long time and really was unproductive creatively. For all fans, it was just sort of a dark period. Apparently, there was a second album made with Cherone, and the rumor has it, you could tell me if you saw this in any of your research, that Warner Brothers rejected it multiple times. And it was almost like Warner Brothers rejecting it caused him to be removed from the band. What did you make of that?
I mean, I heard that they definitely started a record and were at least sort of halfway through it. And yeah, I mean, I could understand it. You know what I mean? Because the record did sort of tank on a sort of level that I guess no one really could have anticipated. And sort of awful reviews and just, like you say, an absolute body blow. And I think obviously the worst thing was for Eddie was that it was the first record, essentially, that he had made properly sober. And he was so proud of it. And he was so proud that he had overcome the crippling anxieties that had sort of derailed his work in the past, and had really made a record that, yeah, he thought represented him and was a great representation of Van Halen as the band and his sort of musical character at the time. So then to have that so sort of absolutely dismissed by the public and, by your peers and by the label and by everyone, it absolutely had to hurt, and it sort of must have stung on a level that was going to simmer for, forever, really. And it did. I mean, he obviously, 20 years on, he still had failed to turn in any significant amount of new original material.
Yeah.
And I could totally imagine that with Warner. They, as I'd heard it, there was half an album made, and there was really no enthusiasm for it from the label. And, you can imagine people just saying, look, it's just not going to work. We don't want to be dicks about this. There are no singles here. There is nothing that's going to elevate this record above the last record. We cannot, in all good faith, basically justify the spend, justify the time that's going to go into this. You need to cut and run, basically. This isn't happening. You give it a shot. No offence to anybody. It happens, sometimes it doesn't, but we cannot underwrite this for the vast amount of money that needs to be pumped into, a record to sort of get it into the, the spotlight and get it onto the shelves in the first place. Like, it's just literally just not worth the investment.
And it's interesting, Ray Daniels, who was the manager at the time, had renegotiated Van Halen's contract with Warner Brothers, but the weird part was they had albums on their contract that they had to pay them for, and they let go of the band. Why would they do that?
Yeah, it seems bizarre, that whole sort of period. I mean, if you remember that sort of late 90s period, I mean, there was a lot of bands from the sort of grunge era, I guess, onwards. There was a lot of bands that have been very much sort of seemed like they'd been consigned to history. But even with that, it's seeing that, obviously this is a band with 10 million selling albums in their catalogue. Why on earth would you want to cut the strings there? There was such a sort of forward-looking, sort of climate in the industry at that time where people were like, oh, this is all about, things have really moved on, and this is like legacy artists are, dead in the water, but there's not enough in this for us to keep carrying on. But it is bizarre. I mean, although sort of, without knowing the sort of business deals behind it and the sort of percentage splits behind those records, or they were going to sort of be reverting back to the artist rather than the label. But it does seem a really, really curious kind of time, and that whole sort of period for Van Halen is so murky. It seems like no one has a fantastic perspective on what exactly was going on, because everything was rudderless, everything was shifting. There was no future gazing, and the past seemed like such a distant past. It's a real shame that, those years are, you sort of have to look back on them in a sort of something of a tragedy. Someone this talented sort of becoming so unmoored, and everything, the lack of respect and the lack of humanity that was sort of being shown towards Eddie at the time really does seem quite breathtaking in retrospect.
Yeah, it does. And what do you make of the whole thing with Fred Durst on page 225 of your book? That also seems like such a strange pairing. Like, what did he have to do with Fred Durst? Was he going to work with Fred Durst? I mean, it seemed like they wouldn't really go together.
Again, absolute madness. I mean, it sounds like a joke. Fred Durst, to his credit, even he seemed to sort of treat it as a joke. But, I mean, maybe somebody thought, no, it's just crazy enough that it just might work. But it's such a bizarre little unfathomable notion. I did a lot of work with the new metal bands at the end of the 90s and stuff. Larger people in those bands kind of hated what they were doing almost. They'd been sort of painted themselves into this corner of being seen as these clowns, and Wes Borland, a very articulate and intelligent man, he came to despise that band and everything he was doing in it, and obviously jumped ship. But I mean, on no level does it make any sense whatsoever, except that, what was it, that Ashton Kutcher show, Punk'd, whatever it was?
Yeah.
That MTV show. I mean, interestingly, I know that there was a photographer who was with Eddie at the time. He actually had another book called Eruption. I think it was called Eruptions in the Valley, perhaps. And he documented a lot of that time, and that book has been caught up in some legal drama at the moment, because I guess there's some discrepancy over what contracts were signed there, and there's some sort of debate with Eddie's estate. It just goes to show the sort of the madness and the total unhinged nature of this period in Eddie's career, because, I mean, no one could make sense of that whatsoever, except that if you were looking at it as like, well, this band is quite popular and that guy is quite popular, but I mean, you might as well have stuck Dolly Parton fronting Van Halen for all the sense it was going to make.
That's true. So now, the kitchen sink tour that they've talked about, the stadium tour they were going to do before Ed got sick, they talk about Sammy and Gary Cherone being part of this, but if you research this is almost fabled in a sense that they were originally going to go on tour utilizing Michael Anthony in sort of a strange capacity, like they were going to keep Wolfgang Van Halen on bass and have Michael Anthony come out for a few songs, but Sammy really had nothing to do with this tour. Neither did Gary Cherone. But since Eddie's passing, everybody keeps talking about, the kitchen sink tour, we were going to do this big tour. That really was never coming into play. It was in 2018 where Irving Azoff was trying to put together this stadium tour with Van Halen, but it would add Michael Anthony. We actually documented this in the podcast because Sammy had gone on Eddie Trunk's show saying, we're going to clear the schedule in the summer for the Circle so Michael Anthony can go do his Van Halen thing. So it was kind of proof that Sammy was not part of this thing. But now everybody in retrospect talks about it was all in the plans. That's all BS. And there's also never any documentation that Dave would agree to tour on stage with Sam. Even when he toured with Sam, he refused to even do a duet on one night. So it's a little interesting how, since Eddie's passed, how the whole narrative gets changed around. What do you think?
I totally agree with that. I mean, I remember started off with this interview I'd mentioned. I was editing a magazine called Planet Rock. So in one point, and I guess it probably was 2018, I was going to put Van Halen on the cover. And a lot of our covers were just sort of, sometimes we had access to the band, sometimes we didn't, sometimes we just told a classic story. And I had talked to Ross Halpin, actually, again, about it. I said, he was like, what have you got coming up? And I was like, we're going to do, a Thin Lizzy cover, we're going to do a Deep Purple cover, we're going to do a Van Halen cover. And he said, you should hang on for Van Halen, because he said, they're doing that stadium tour, he said, I've been talking about it. That's happening. The Foo Fighters are going to support for a show or two. Metallica are going to support for a show or two. That's definitely in the works. So if you can hang back by 6 months or, whatever, it would be better timing, and I might be able to get you stuff with Eddie then. I was like, well, I'm not really sure that's going to happen. I don't necessarily want to sit on this. It was a magazine that kind of, to an extent, existed from issue to issue. I couldn't be sure that the magazine was going to be there in 5 issues time kind of thing. So I was like, I don't really want to sit on one of the banker bands that I know is going to sell copies. I don't really want to park that for a year or on the off chance of this happening, even though I take your word for it and I know you're tight with the Van Halen guys when push comes to shove, but still I'm not sure I can be prepared to wait on that. I knew that was being talked about, but at the same time I was interviewing Sammy around then as well, and he was sort of saying, oh look, I would do one show or whatever. It was kind of like a farm aid almost, where we raise money for food bank, or if something bigger, I'll do that. I don't need to get paid for it, blah blah blah. But it wasn't yeah, let's do this, let's go out there, toe to toe, 2 songs of yours, 2 songs of mine. That wasn't in the offing. And obviously things do get a little, not saying that anybody was flat out lying about that, but it's one of these things where, I guess, in retrospect, people can look at it differently and think, yeah, well, actually, if we were going to round things up, then that would have been the logical thing to do, to have everybody involved. But that, yeah, like you say, that wasn't what was being sold to promoters, and that wasn't what was being talked about, the idea of this sort of grand, it was a grand farewell, but it wasn't necessarily supposed to be a grand farewell in the sense of covering every chapter.
Right. And what would the point of bringing Gary Cherone on that for? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, even for Gary Cherone, even he would have been like, but why? Literally nobody has any fond memories of this, myself included. What are we going to do, 1 song, 2 songs? It's only going to be getting in the way, and it's only going to be a reminder of the most sort of crushing failure in the band's career. Why would you want to do that in front of a stadium full of people every night? That would be embarrassing for all concerned, unless that Eddie was so adamant that 1 song or 2 songs were right up there with the greatest things he'd ever written, and was determined to push that out every night. You can imagine the queues for the toilets and the beer concessions at that point. Knock out the 7-minute Van Halen 3 segment.
Right.
It would have been insanity.
Yeah, it's true. And what did you make of Dave's retirement announcement? It kind of came as a shock to me. I didn't think of him as a guy who was going to retire. I thought he'd be playing old age homes until he dropped. What do you make of that? Do you think something's wrong with him?
I don't know. I wouldn't like to speculate. In a sense, Dave was the person who inadvertently kind of leaked, the sort of rumor of Eddie's illness, because, when he sort of originally signed up for that residency, and he sort of said, oh, well, Van Halen's over as we know it, but that's Eddie's story to tell. And then Wolfgang, who was forever so diplomatic on things, sort of said, I don't think it's David's place to be saying that. So there was sort of an element to that made you think, oh, hang on, what's going on there? Because that seemed unusual. I certainly hadn't put 2 and 2 together at that point, but I can imagine a lot of people did, and they sort of raised eyebrows and set alarms ringing and be like, oh, why is he saying that? In a way that sort of went beyond, I think Eddie's a bit tired of this. In retrospect now, you can see that it was more than that. But, David Lee Roth brought such sort of joy to both over the years, and always been just such a character and such an ebullient sort of effervescent sort of face of rock and roll, that I kind of wouldn't like to speculate really on what his reasoning is there. It seemed very abrupt and very out of the blue, and also so low key in a way that it was given to a local newspaper reporter kind of thing, and in what was just supposed to be a little primer preview for the shows and stuff. You would have thought that if Dave was going to go out, he was going to go out all guns blazing, and it would have been an interview with Rolling Stone or an interview with MTV or the New York Times, the big show-stopping announcement. It seems an odd way to sort of slip it out there and go, even that whole interview is interesting. Literally, the guy didn't get to ask a question. Dave sort of said, okay, I've got this news for you, and I'm going to talk now. And he sort of gives his whole spiel, and then that was it.
Yeah, he said some dark things, though, in there. Eddie, I'm in the rearview mirror and not too far behind you. My doctors are informing me. It's like, what? It just seemed really, really strange and out of the ordinary. And I also felt that his announcement was highly emotional, which is not like him at all. It seemed out of character.
Yeah, it seems like the sort of thing that if you had literally just received, bad news and hadn't really processed it to yourself and were sort of almost speaking off the cuff, as your sort of immediate reaction to something, that you would say it. But yeah, for someone who's very, very aware of how the press works and how media works and how entertainment news works, it was a very un-David Lee Roth kind of way of announcing that exit. How that pans out, I guess, remains to be seen, and there's been no further statement really explaining it in any great depth since. So we'll have to wait and see. But I sincerely hope it's not something related to